bombshell that really rocked cricket at the time. I need you to bowl 3 no balls for this guy. This point, this point, and this point. He gave me money, he offered me women, he offered me drink and drugs, and Afridi knew it and he tried to stop it. But when things were inevitable, there's nothing you can do about it. Yes, Afridi is an interesting character in this whole saga. Abdul Razak, who again had his suspicions, it was in his shop that Majeed brought this damaged black. Now, Afridi had once worked with Majeed. Mazhar Mahmood went to jail in 2016. He ended up in Fort Open prison, which is where Majeed himself was once incarcerated.
आज से 10 साल पहले लॉर्ड्स के क्रिकेट ग्राउंड में 3 पाकिस्तानी प्लेयर सलमान बट, मोहम्मद आसिफ और मोहम्मद आमिर को मैच फिक्सिंग के इल्ज़ाम में पकड़ा गया था। उसके बाद उनको सज़ाएं हुई। वो जो वाक़या हुआ था उसमें उसने पूरे पाकिस्तानी क्रिकेट को बहुत ज़्यादा नुकसान पहुंचाया था। ब्रिटिश पाकिस्तानी 2 कैरेक्टर्स थे, मज़हर महमूद और मज़हर मजीद। मज़हर महमूद न्यूज़ ऑफ द वर्ल्ड के लिए काम करते थे, जिन्होंने ये खबर एक्सक्लूसिव स्टोरी उन्होंने ब्रेक की थी। मज़हर मजीद पाकिस्तानी प्लेयर्स के, जिन 3 प्लेयर्स का हमने नाम लिया है, उनके एजेंट थे जो मैच फिक्सिंग करते हुए जिनके बारे में एविडेंस सामने आया था। वो वाली जो इन्वेस्टिगेशन थी, उस इन्वेस्टिगेशन के ऊपर संडे टाइम्स के एडिटर हैं निक ग्रेन्सलेड, उन्होंने एक्सटेंसिव इन्वेस्टिगेशन की है कि आखिर वो वाली स्टोरी थी क्या, कौन करेक्टर्स उसमें इन्वॉल्व थे, और सबसे इम्पॉर्टेंट बात यह है कि आखिर वो वाली स्टोरी शुरू कहाँ से हुई थी। बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग डिटेल्स हैं कि वो जो सारी खबर थी, वो जो सारी इन्वेस्टिगेशन थी, वो एक ब्लैकबेरी से शुरू हुई थी और ब्लैकबेरी पानी में गिरा श्रीलंका में। उसके बाद वो लंदन आया, जहाँ पहली बार एक पाकिस्तानी दुकानदार को वो दिया गया फिक्सिंग के लिए, जहाँ से वो सारी स्टोरी निकली। निक ग्रेन्सलैंड की ये बहुत बड़ी इन्वेस्टिगेशन है जो पाकिस्तानी क्रिकेट के हवाले से आज हम उनसे जानते हैं कि उन्होंने ये जो इन्वेस्टिगेशन अपनी पब्लिश की है, उस हवाले से हमें बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग डिटेल्स आज बताएंगे। Nick, your investigation is a gripping tale of what unfolded in Britain 10 years ago when 3 Pakistani players were caught cheating the game of cricket.
Yes, thank you for those kind words. It was a bombshell that really rocked cricket at the time. This was a story that made the front pages, not just in England, but around the world. It was on news channels as well as sports channels. It was probably the most serious crisis to hit the sport of cricket. The News of the World newspaper had to close 11 months after this extraordinary investigation because of phone hacking allegations. And then you had several years after that, the man who had led the investigation, Mazhar Mahmood, the chief investigations editor for the paper, himself ended up behind bars. So I thought there was a good story there from the newspaper's angle. I also thought cricket and fixing is an issue which refuses to go away out. And finally, I wanted to get more of an appreciation of what it was like for the Pakistan players, the 3 players who were involved, how they had come to be roped into this. I think certainly Mohammed Amir, the youngest, the 18-year-old, I think the phrase, he had been groomed by his agent and his captain.
You say that the cancer actually continues in cricket. You also repeatedly mentioned in your own investigation that there is repeated mention of Indian bookies behind, getting involved in match fixing. There were incidents in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. There were meetings in London. That network of well-established network of bookies in India and elsewhere, that continues. And how do you see that the ICC actually came to know about it? Then they did not put a lot of resources into going after those bookies.
They don't have the powers to make arrests, to subpoena records, to look at people's bank accounts and telephone communications. So their hands are slightly tied there. So they are fighting a very difficult battle. I think they were very slow to pick up on the menace of fixing. I think they can be held culpable for that. I don't think they appreciated how widespread it was within Asia. The Metropolitan Police Service in this country, one of their officers said to a News of the World journalist and indeed a lawyer who was involved in the case, if it hadn't been for the News of the World creating such a fanfare and making sure this story was known around the world, it's unlikely they actually would have pressed charges, or they would have really taken it as far as they could. There's another element to this, which is in some countries, in some cricket countries now, that's still not a criminal offence to commit fixing. Even in England in 2010, a lot of lawyers who work for the Crown Prosecution Service weren't quite sure which charges to bring against the 3 Pakistan players. It was clear they were guilty of fixing, but what were the exact laws that they had contravened? Now, they've now certified the laws in this country on fixing, and Australia did the same.
You deal with cricket, you deal with sports all the time. So can you tell us that what kind of fixing is still continuing to take place? Are there any, the bookies and the people involved in it, have they become more innovative? Have they become more careful? And have they come up with new forms of fixing?
Fixing is never going to go away from any sport. As long as you have betting, whether it's underground betting or official betting channels, that element of corruption, of being open to corruption, is always going to be there. Whether it's cricket, football, hockey, you name it, that will always go on. I think in cricket, to use this specific example, what we saw initially, we saw match fixing or trying to engineer results. And you'll recall the Hansi Cronje affair, which preceded this one by 10 years, where Cronje had tried to engineer a result in, a test match involving England. And there's further evidence he had tried to force his side to lose games, one-day internationals, I think, against India and other countries. So there was the initial fixing element was mainly on results, and then, as these things do, once they get pushed underground, they become more sophisticated. So in this particular case, you have no balls. You had brackets, whether a certain number of runs are scored in a 5-over period, a 10-over period. So it's always going to get more sophisticated and complicated because that's the nature of capitalism, as it were. It's always trying to find ways to improve itself and to make more money.
There is no denying that Mazhar Mahmood was a brilliant reporter. Without him, this story would never have come out. But how do you see Mazhar Mahmood ending up where he is?
Mazhar Mahmood went to jail in 2016. I think he was handed a year's sentence, of which he only served 6 months. Ironically, he ended up in Ford Open Prison, which is where Majeed himself was once incarcerated. He came out in 2017. And what happened after that was you suddenly had an avalanche of lawsuits being submitted against News UK, which is the company I also work for, the company that owned the News of the World as well as the Sunday Times, by celebrities who had previously been exposed by Mahmood and whose reputations had been tarnished as a result. They all brought lawsuits for quite considerable sums of money against Mahmood, including Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, who was married to Prince Andrew, and her former boyfriend John Bryant. They were the two most high-profile litigants. And their complaint was this. They said, well, look, this criminal trial in which Mahmood has been convicted shows that he used underhand means, quite probably illegal means, and that he lied when he pursued these investigations. We believe that applies to what happened with us, front page stories he wrote in the News of the World. We cannot believe that he could have got away with these stories without deploying underhand and illegal means, and therefore we're filing for damages from your company. I think in the case of the lawyers for Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, they were talking around 40 million in terms of lost earnings and damage to reputation. So when Mahmood comes out of jail, there are all these litigants against him, and he gets drawn back into the orbit of News UK, this company whose headquarters in which I'm sitting now. And he has to work with the legal department to say, well, actually, I didn't use underhand means there. And all we can say so far is that there have been no cases reported whatsoever of News UK settling with those litigants. So in some ways, his reputation has not been completely damaged, despite going to jail. Many of those stories, those exposés, still stand. And again, it's important to add that he was in no way affected by the phone hacking allegations which brought down the News of the World. But his career in journalism is over now, effectively. He still lives in the UK. But this particular story, the Pakistan spot fixing story, is watertight in terms of his methods and how he brought them to book.
The biggest cricket corruption scandal came into the light because Mazhar Majeed's BlackBerry, his son dropped it into water in Sri Lanka somewhere during holidays. That BlackBerry was brought to London by Mazhar Majeed for fixing. He gave it to a Pakistani shopkeeper to fix it. And it is believed that that is where the whole story started from. And if that phone, Mazhar's son, had not dropped into the water, we probably today would not have actually known that at what level corruption was taking place.
Now, Afridi had once worked with Majeed. He had acted for him in some commercial matters, and then they'd fallen out. And Afridi had a very dim view of Majeed as a result. A friend of his in London, who ran a telephone repair shop, a Pakistani, by sheer coincidence, it was in his shop that Majeed had brought this damaged BlackBerry, which, as you said, had been dropped by his son on the beach in Sri Lanka into the water. I think it was during the Asia Cup in June 2010. The man in the telephone repair shop started to repair it, saw these messages, recognized various names, and suddenly thought, wow, what's going on here? There's something not right here. He then shared the BlackBerry messages with a small group of contacts, some of whom, not just Afridi, some of whom were involved in Pakistan cricket or had been involved in Pakistan cricket. Among them, Afridi sees the messages and brings them to the attention of the PCB officials, and their reaction was not as strong as he would have hoped it had been. He talks to Waqar Younis, who is the bowling coach, about it, but nothing really happens when they get to England in the summer of 2010. Now, at the same time, another of those people who has received the BlackBerry messages from the man in the phone repair shop contacts both the ICC, the International Cricket Council, saying, I think you need to do something about this. This agent, Majeed, I've had my suspicions about him for a long time, and here you go, look at these messages. Now, the ICC isn't quite able to get its act together in time to stop the fix of the no balls at Lords, but what happens is the same contact goes to Mazhar Mahmood of the News of the World, again presents these BlackBerry messages, which are very indicative of corruption and fixing, presents them to Mahmood and says, right, here's the evidence, here's the contact details for Majeed, you need to investigate this guy. And it all happens extremely quickly. That happens, I think, in July 2010, and then we come forward a month, just a couple of weeks, to August 2010, when Mahmood has his first meeting at the Dorchester Hotel, the Hilton Hotel on Park Lane with Majeed, and within 2 weeks they formed a business relationship, or what Majeed thinks is a business relationship. And as I say, in exchange for, it's actually £150,000 in total, Majeed is telling his players, I need you to bowl 3 no balls for this guy, this point, and this point.
What do you think was the role of Shahid Afridi in the whole scandal? Because he took a very clear stance at that time as well, and later on, as you said, and your own investigation shows that Shahid had a very dim view of Mazhar Majeed.
Yes, Afridi is an interesting character in this whole saga. Obviously, he had been captain of Pakistan. He came over in the summer of 2010. Pakistan actually played 2 series in England. They had to play a series against Australia because they couldn't play home tests, obviously, in Pakistan at the time. They played those, I think, in London and Leeds. And then they moved on to the series against England later that summer. Now, Afridi started as captain, the test series against Australia, and then resigned. There's a point in his book where I think he walks off after being dismissed against Australia, and he's decided he's had enough. And I think clearly a factor in that was this knowledge that some of his players weren't playing by the book. That they were not only were they working against him individually, because again there's quotes from Mazhar Majeed that the players didn't like Afridi, but they were trying to fix matches and undermine results. So Afridi resigns and flies back to Pakistan, turning his back on the team. He's still captain of the T20 team, but he knows, or at least he suspects, what's going on. He also recounts conversations with Abdul Razak, who again had his suspicions about the players involved. Nothing came of those. They couldn't get the PCB to take whatever action was needed to keep Mazhar Majeed away from the players. And then we have the situation that unfolds at Lords in August 2010, at the end of August 2010. Now then, Afridi then finds out about the whole fixing as he's due to fly back into England for the T20 series that follows, and he's not one bit surprised. In fact, he says that to to one of his contacts in London, who phones him up to say this has happened, and he said this was inevitable, and it was inevitable, and Afridi knew it, and he tried to stop it, but when things are inevitable, there's nothing you can do about it. And as I say, there's lots of evidence, or lots of the transcripts involving Majeed and Mahmood, in which Majeed is sort of, his tongue is loosened, he's talking very candidly. He says, my players, they want Afridi out. They want Salman Butt as captain. Now, we don't know whether which players they were. We must assume they're Amir and Asif, because other than Butt, they're the only ones that have been convicted of fixing. If you get Afridi out of the way as captain and Butt as captain, then clearly the fixing can go on for as long as you want it to. Afridi flies in for the T20 series after the test matches, pulls Mohammed Amir aside, and he can see clearly that Amir is caught up in something bigger than him, that he hasn't really got any understanding of what he's been involved in. And he says, in a quiet word, he says, were you involved in this? Did you know what you were doing? And Amir admits, yes, he bowled a no ball to order, as his agent had done. This is all in private. And Afridi tries to convince him. He says, you need to confess. It'll be good for you. But Amir's young. It's a horrible situation for anyone to be in. And he refuses to admit his guilt. And he doesn't admit his guilt until almost a year later, when the criminal trial is due to start.
Innocent and completely credible Pakistani players were also affected as a result of this scandal. How do you see Pakistani cricket coming off since then, in the last 10 years?
I have a huge amount of sympathy, actually, for those people who were in the Pakistan dressing room at the time, and those who've subsequently paid to Pakistan and have had to operate under the shadow of suspicion, which unfortunately has tended to follow Pakistan more than any other country. There's a particular point in the book, I recall, where Andrew Strauss, who is the England captain, when they were playing Pakistan, he talked about the month that followed when they had this particularly acrimonious one-day series between the two countries. And Strauss said it was a very bad time for England. And then he paused for a moment and he said, now I think about it, I realise it must have been even worse for anyone caught up in it in that Pakistan dressing room who had to deal with.
Mazhar Mahmood, Mazhar Majeed and Salman Butt were the central characters of the original story, as well as the year-on investigation into it. All of them, make a very fascinating story.
They were three fascinating characters, all in many ways quite similar. Mazhar Majeed and Mazhar Mahmood, both in fact must have at one point been living quite close to each other without knowing it, but not too different in terms of their family background, roughly the same age. Both very ambitious. One, Mahmood, a very ambitious journalist. Majeed, an agent, very ambitious to make as much money as he could, wanted to be famous. Now you then have Salman Butt. Majeed claimed to represent at least 5, possibly 6 or 7 Pakistan cricketers at the time. But Butt was his prize asset. There's no doubt about that. The reasons for that are simple. He was a player in the peak of his form. He was one of the best batsmen in the team. He'd just been appointed captain, so there was quite a strong chance he was going to be captain for a long time, and therefore would hold a lot of influence within the team in terms of selection and everything that goes with being captain. And he was very well educated. He was a good sort of spokesman, ambassador for the Pakistan team.
Mazhar Mahmood was arguably a genius reporter and probably one of the best reporters of his generation. He made headlines in Britain and across the world, and he literally at one stage he ruled at least tabloid journalism in Britain. But then things did not go down well with him. He was accused of, later on he was jailed, he was accused of entrapment and encouraging corruption. Similar kind of tactics that he applied in case of the Pakistani cricketers, but that angle of the enticement and the encouragement of corruption was not highlighted during the trial, and the media did not pay a lot of attention to that. How do you see that element?
Yes, it's an interesting point you make. I've spoken to several people, particularly those around Mohammed Amir, who were quite cynical about Mahmood. And I think their point was this, that he had essentially precipitated a crime. He had forced a crime to be committed. And while clearly Butt and Majeed were open to corruption, that's clear, they had dragged Amir into it because he had to bowl another of the no balls. And actually, he was caught in the crossfire of it. And by his actions, Mahmood had effectively criminalised an innocent young man, as much as Butt and Majeed had criminalised him by grooming him, I think is the word to say. So Mahmood is a very divisive figure, and his methods are particularly controversial within the worlds of British journalism. And even before this particular case, there had been previous examples where people had ended up in jail saying, well, I was a victim of entrapment. You know, I did things because he gave me money, he offered me women, he offered me drink and drugs, and I wouldn't have done these things without that influence. Now, you can understand their point, but equally, there's another very simple point to that, is no one is forced into doing anything. Mazhar Mahmood didn't force anyone to bowl a no ball. He put £140,000 on the table and said, if you do it, that's what you'll get. And that's what he got.
Mazhar Mahmood's methods were exposed during the trial of pop star Tulisa at the Old Bailey, and because of those, he was then jailed. How do you see, the Mazhar Mahmood's brand of journalism, and then he ended up making a lot of enemies, not only in the world of crimes, but also within the media fraternity?
We now go forward 6 years when he was convicted of, I think it was conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. He lied in a pre-court hearing about whether he had discussed the evidence of one of his fellow witnesses against a pop star whom he had exposed for drug taking and for attempting to buy drugs on his behalf, or rather on the behalf of a person whom he was pretending to be. Now, he was convicted because the evidence against him was overwhelming. And a lot of people at that point, a lot of enemies in British journalism, because Mahmood did have a lot of enemies in British journalism who didn't like his newspaper, didn't like the way he went about things, said, actually, he had been doing this all along. You finally got him, but he should have been stopped years ago. All we can say to that is that clearly the evidence which he had received before the no balls were bowled indicated that certainly the agent, Mazhar Majeed, and Salman Butt were interfixing, for want of a better phrase. And therefore, and he even discussed this with his lawyer, he said, are we okay to follow this line of inquiry to set up what's known as a sting? Is it within public interest? And the News of the World lawyer said, yes, there is evidence here of illegality, and therefore we can pursue it, and we can pursue it in the means in which he did, which, as I said, was putting £140,000 on the table and asking Mazhar Majeed to instruct his players to deliver no balls, and that's what happened.